I'm Randy Tayler, and I want to start by introducing everybody here, but I don't know them. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We'll start with Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Baxter. I am an author and a podcaster, one of the hosts of A More Civilized podcast. If you like Star Wars, which you're here, so you probably do. And if pertinent to this panel, I have some history in instructing on video games at UVU and critiquing video games, and I'm currently working on some video games. So,
my name is Brennan Smith. I helped start, my thesis advisor and I helped start the BYU Games project. I worked on 3 of the games and was the first person to graduate with a master's degree in computer science with an emphasis in game design from BYU. I put myself through school making Minecraft mod packs. My biggest mod pack, Blightfall, added a whole lot of story to Minecraft and was well received and had like 3 million downloads. Right now I'm making 2 games, but they're both little and I haven't picked up a publisher for either of them yet.
And I'm David Farland. I'm primarily a novelist, but I also worked in Hollywood as a greenlighting analyst for a little bit. I've also done a bit of video game design. My first game was called StarCraft Brood Wars, which went on and did pretty well. And then I did a bunch of other ones where I was a scripter for video games. I'm an old gamer from way back doing role-playing games. Created my own role-playing games back in the 1970s and 80s and had a lot of fun doing that. So it was just kind of a natural thing to move on to that. Beyond that, I've worked a little bit with people who are doing graphic novels and things like that. And so I'm interested in a lot of different types of things. I'm also a screenwriter and worked in Hollywood as a greenlighting analyst for helping producers and directors and funders decide whether or not to make films.
Well, I'm Marion G. Harmon. I'm a published author of the series Wearing the Cape, which started in 2011. Book 8 is going to be out this year. And it looks like I'm the only one maybe talking about physical role-playing games of the traditional type, so the one who has a prop to show. That project began 2 years ago because I had an itch to scratch. I was a D&D player all the way back when it was AD&D First Edition. Some of you might recognize that.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, so for a long time. And I basically learned by doing as a self-publisher in the gaming field. And so that's kind of the background I think would tap me for this panel.
Thank you. Open question, maybe. What is your favorite game adaptation beyond your own that you've played?
Well, in video games, I go immediately to BioShock, which that's a bit of a stretch calling it an adaptation, but it's definitely a heavily influenced response to Ayn Rand's works. So that is one of my favorites. And stepping out of video games, I am really impressed with Planet Mercenary, the RPG based on Shovelware.
I really appreciate the most recent Star Wars MMO. I haven't gotten very far in it, but I really appreciate how they were able to make your character feel like an important part of the universe, even though your character doesn't have any canonical significance in the actual movie world.
I have to admit that I don't get to play games hardly ever at all because I'm too busy working most of the time. Gosh, I don't feel like I have a wide, varied experience here. You know, I play a few Star Wars games, and it seems like I about once a year I go download a bunch of games and play them just to see what's going on in the gaming industry right now, but I don't get to do it as much as I'd like.
Yeah, could you pull it over the computer? Pretty much same here. When you're in the profession of turning out material and writing, you don't have as much time to enjoy it as you'd like. I also really dropped out of the full time where you'd spend a whole Saturday every month or two. Way back when it was still, the intellectual properties were not a big thing. So I think the first one I ever saw was Star Trek, and that was by FASA when I was back in college, and that still remains my favorite. They do have longer iterations of that. I collect role-playing games just to see how they modify it from the intellectual property. So I've got the Dresden Files, I've got Firefly is one of my favorites, just the adaptation. Going into the superhero medium again, don't know if you guys are aware of the Margaret Weis production of Marvel Superheroic, which was very short-lived, but probably the best adaptation I've seen of a superhero property. So,
And before you pass that back, what are some of the biggest differences in some of these games? Like what makes them stand out?
are you talking about?
I'm thinking rules, like the different rule set for Firefly versus Star Wars and.
Okay, I think the most successful ones have flavor baked into the rules themselves. So they might start as a generic system, but they have to adapt them so that your experience is very much like the characters would when they're getting into their fights or everything else. So it feels like you're engaging in the activities and the genre of the novel or the game that you're adapting to. Usually rules that are more narrative heavy and rule light are the more successful ones, because that allows the GM and the players the most buy-in on their characterizations, and the rules don't get in the way as much. I don't know if that helps any.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you guys have thoughts on that?
One of the things that I think that the Star Wars MMO did well that I appreciate in any of the games that I play is that there are a lot of movie adaptations into video games where they're called shovelware, that it's just you're trying to get something out the door as quickly as possible in order to meet a deadline that coincides with movie release or something like that. And very often you end up just retracing the movie one step at a time, like going through all of the same plot points, and it feels very on the rails and detracts from the gameplay experience. I really appreciate movie games that allow you to do something different, that because you're outside of the context of the main story, you have other stories where you can be more in control and where you are freed from the prior plot in order to make a plot that more closely fits with game design, so that you can design the game around the story and so that you can design the story around the game mechanics instead of trying to make game mechanics that represent every plot point in the story.
I would say the best video game adaptations of other mediums tend to take kind of a two-pronged approach of first, what about this property is most integral to keeping the feel of being part of this property, and so making sure we retain that in this game, and then also what are the elements that make a good game that are already present in this property that we can highlight, is focusing on that, the medium and its strengths, and then the property strengths that mirror that, rather than just shoveling it into a new medium.
Yeah, I think when I look at a game versus a movie, one of the most important factors to me, years ago I was asked to help find a book to push big as a novel for the coming year. And so I looked at 40 different properties and came up with one. And I was looking at books that could be turned into movies, video games, toy lines, etc. And the book that I chose to push big was called Harry Potter. And so we went and created an advertising campaign for it and took it big. But the thing that always interests me is that when I am moving from one medium to another, when I'm moving from book to movie, or from movie to video game, or from video game to role-playing game, I want to look at it and say, how can I make the very best product that I can? How can I make, if I've got a movie and I want to make it into a video game, how can I make the video game better than the movie? Okay? In other words, I want each of the mediums to be value added, so that even if the movie sucks and fails, that the video game will be considered a classic 10 years from now. That's my goal in trying to move between mediums.
This laptop.
It's just right in the way. We should just throw it against the wall.
It's an apple. It's a Mac.
Probably put it on the chair there.
I'll put it on the chair.
There you go.
So what then,
Eventually.
in line with what you were saying, David, what are some of the biggest weaknesses that game adaptations suffer from or can suffer from?
I'm just in line here. Do you mind if I?
Sure, go
I'm
ahead.
just going to add. A lot of them tend to be very sparse on story. You'll have a spot of story and then some monotonous gameplay before you finally get to a story. Your average video game is going to be from 20 to 40 hours of gameplay is usually what they're aiming for. A lot more shorter games these days that are running for shorter run times, but even so, they're looking at 5 to 10 hours. Compared to a movie is a vast amount of story, and even compared to a lot of books is, since you're not delving into a lot of the specifics the way a book does, you're running around the world, it can get very bland and monotonous because they're not fleshing things out in a way that is going to be engaging for the audience.
Yeah, characters is a huge thing, okay? That's kind of what he's talking about. But also expanding upon the universe. When you've got a video game, and let's say you've got a 2-hour movie, and you're going to turn it into a 40-hour video game, it seems to me that you've got lots of opportunities to create new points of interest, okay, is what we often call them in the industry. So when I'm creating a book, I might say, I want to have 20 points of interest. I'm in the industry of creating wonder literature. And whether you're doing it in books or in games, it's all the same. It's all trying to arouse a sense of wonder. And if I just take a Harry Potter movie and I say, okay, we're going to move from this room to this class to, what's going to happen is you've already seen all of that. You're already suffering what's called eye fatigue in Hollywood. And so you want to see something new and different and exciting. And so the first thing I look at is, what points of interest can I add? What can I do that's different in this universe? The second thing I look at is, what kind of story can I tell? How can I get it down to so that the character is important to the player and they feel that they really connect with this? And then I move into other things like what other cool things can I do? Like what kinds of weapons or magical spells can I add? But I always am looking at how can I play with this? And then if they've got a magic system or a rule system, because all rule systems, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or magic systems, in my point of view, then I want to say, okay, what are some cool ways to play on it that the creator never thought of? Okay, so I want to explore it more deeply than what has been done before.
I've got a question from he who is more experienced. Have you ever run into a situation in which the authors are nervous about expanding on the creative work? I've heard that authors really value faithful reproductions of their source material and are nervous about giving creative control to other people. Have you ever struggled with that?
Absolutely. When I was writing for Star Wars, for example, when we did episode 1, they wouldn't even show us a copy of the script. So we didn't know what the characters looked like or what they sounded like. You can't write the thing, okay? So trying to do a novelization or something like that was absolutely impossible. So yeah, you run into that from time to time, where people say, yeah, this is so big you can't play with it. George Lucas is actually pretty free with most of the Star Wars stuff until I got to episode 1, at which point, now you've got to be absolutely faithful. You can't vary and you can't add characters or descriptions or anything like that. And it was really tough. And you'll find that whether it be novelists, video game producers, there's always someone who feels like that. You have to, as a creator, you have to basically cajole them and convince them that, hey, this would be cool to do. But that's about all you can do.
Very good.
Well, as the one at this table that has the experience of actually converting his own stuff into a game medium, I kind of had the opposite problem. But it's also an opportunity as well, because, and to be honest, probably about a third of the people who picked up my game during the original launch campaign were not even role-playing gamers, because they heard there's 30 pages in there of world background that you don't see in the books. And they go, okay, I'll pay $50 for that. And I was like, oh, All right. It's a good sign, obviously, when people love your stuff enough that they want to play in your world, but it then becomes a responsibility that you take all that stuff that was, a lot of it was half-formed, a lot of it was little writer's notes when you were first writing, and you now have to figure out, going back to the magic systems, that when I did my first novel, I had a general outline of what the powers are going to be like and how they work. When I did the game, then I had to figure out, okay, how does all this logically string together so that players can replicate the same experience and feel and overall in the game. And it actually helped my later books because I then rethought a bunch of stuff and all sorts of things came out of that I could then add in later. So it was kind of a heterodyning experience.
I've never heard that word used in public before. Heterodyning.
It's probably not used properly either.
I've got more questions, but I wanted to pause and see if you guys have questions that you came here hoping to get answered. Yeah.
Okay, so when you're kind of wanting to adapt something, like what's the kind of minimum things you'll need, like in terms of like a product or people to network with to kind of launch it, so you're not just like a lone person doing everything yourself?
Minimum thing you need is a copyright. Seriously, you have to have permission, you know. And I have people from time to time who will contact me and say, "Hey, can I do the Rune Lords novel as a role-playing game?" And I'm like, "Well, I talked to Gary Gygax about that a few years ago, and you know, I really like working with pros, and so it doesn't matter that you don't have any credentials. I have a fellow who's actually doing a tabletop game right now, who came to me, and he was a musician and an artist, and I looked at his work and I thought, you know, this guy's got something. I think I'd like to go with him for doing a tabletop game. I couldn't imagine myself ever doing that. So the fact that you don't have a name or a reputation is okay, but you do have to work with the author to get permission, and that may be a big movie company. That may be very difficult, but if you're just working on a book or something like that, that's okay.
You had a question.
How do you balance new points of interest with familiar and nostalgic settings? Because like if every scene is a new point of interest, and you're just like, where the heck are we?
That's always a fun question because I usually do it based on a mathematical formula. And so if I were going to do a Star Wars movie, for example, I would probably start you out in familiar territory. And then I would say, okay, I want to have 75% new material and 25% things that you've seen, so that you don't feel like you're stepping into something that's just completely, utterly non-Star Wars. And I also want to try to match the style of the art so that you don't feel like you've, gone into, Bizarro World or something like that. But really, what I do is I usually talk to the people that I was working with, and I'd say, I'd like to create something new. Do I have your permission? And like I said, George Lucas was always really easy to work with. But if I was doing something like working with Random House on the Mummy movies, then they were a little bit tougher, okay? So it just depends upon the producers, directors, studios that you're working with, and what they'll let you get away with. And they typically have their own sense of what they want to allow. They don't want you. It's kind of funny because some of them don't want you to upstage them. And so if you come up with a really cool idea, it's sort of like, oh, that's too cool, we'll use it in the movie. I literally had that happen. I came up with an idea for a video game, and I took it to some folks at a game company, and they turned it into a full-length motion picture instead. And I was like, okay, well, it'd be nice if you would have paid me for that.
I think that, as Marion had said, though, that like the ideal situation is for it to be a continuation of an existing world instead of a rehashing of a plot that people have already seen. I like, for instance, the Mistborn Birthright game that was canceled and may it rest in peace. It was not a adaptation of the Mistborn plot, but rather it was an exploration of another part of the Mistborn universe. So that way it would be new and fresh in terms of plot, but still be in the same familiar setting that you were talking about. So I think that the 25% that he mentioned isn't a plot 25%. It's more of the 25% could be the setting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like Knights of the Old Republic, the original Old Republic game where they went, well, we're just going to kind of toss everything, all the characters, everything about that immediate time period out the window, but we're still going to have Jedi, we're still going to have Sith, we're still going to have lightsabers, we're still going to have, every vehicle in Knights of the Old Republic was in some way reminiscent of vehicles we've already seen in Star Wars. There's a lot of really familiar grounding there. And then taking the liberty to go new places with characters and plot and some aspects of the setting, but still wrapping you in that familiar. And I agree that most of the most successful direct adaptations, video games directly adapting something, tend to be things that were not that well known already, like Metro 2033 or The Witcher, where, obviously The Witcher was really popular in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, but over here, no one knew it. And that's part of it. Well, okay.
No, I didn't.
A few people did know it, but no, it's part of why that's able to be so successful as a direct adaptation is because most of the people picking it up aren't already familiar with it. But most other video games that are really successful adaptations are ones that take a percentage and then either go their own directions or let you go your own direction like you get with an RPG.
You mentioned Knights of the Old Republic. There was a game that I played back in '98. It was Star Wars Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight.
Yes.
And it had very little tying into any of the Star Wars movies. It was before the prequels came out. But it had lightsabers and droids and intrigue, and it was just the most fun I had with an adaptation that I could think of.
A lot of good things about that game. Yeah.
That whole series.
Yeah. So going back even further, I don't know. Did any of you guys play the Zork type games? Are you old enough to remember those? Mm-hmm. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had a text adventure where they did a decent job of maintaining some of the humor and playing on what Zork players might have expected to be a constant rule, and they broke rules in the game to make it more reminiscent of the absurdity of hitchhikers. What can be added to the story besides the narrative that you're changing and the characters that you're changing? What differences in the medium do you see when something is adapted to a game? In a movie, right, we're forced into this is the story, and the credits roll, and that's the end. What's the best part of adapting for a game?
In my experience, one of the great strengths, if you were in my last panel, I discussed this, that one of the great strengths of video games is putting you in the head of the protagonist like no other medium really can. Books come the closest. Books can really explain to you why someone thinks something, you can understand that. But video games, if they're doing their job right and you're playing it right, you will start thinking the way that protagonist does. They really get you in their head. And so I'd say that a lot of the best adaptations are ones that really take advantage of putting you in that headspace. And when they give you choices, they're letting you role play to its fullest, and they're giving you an opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to play myself. I'm not going to be myself. They give you reasons to be someone else and do something else. And I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I'll steal this again if I grab it.
One of the things that I think is interesting in the field of video games is that people will not continue playing unless they are having fun and feeling fulfilled in some way. And so because of that, sometimes you need to adapt plot points that would make the player feel powerless or bad about themselves in order to make it so that they can feel victory even when they're on the low end of a try-fail cycle, narratively speaking. StarCraft Warcraft did this well is that there's this one time where this planet was being completely overrun by the Zerg. And instead of just like, well, okay, you've lost because the planet is overrun by the Zerg, you had an opportunity to be heroic by saving as many people as you could when you were leaving. So even though, like, narratively speaking, the planet was lost and overrun and it's horrible and stuff like that, you as a player felt awesome because you were able to do something awesome in the middle of this depression. And so I think that one of the things that you need to keep in mind as you're adapting stuff into games is that the player needs to have success experiences in order to make it an engaging experience.
Yeah, when I was young, I used to be a DM and would run role-playing games, and very often I would have 20, 25 people there. And you'd have to look at the different personalities and say, okay, what kind of character does this person like to play? What are they looking for? You know, if there's a locked door, the thieves want to get through it. The barbarian wants to bash through it. The magician might want to magic through it, etc. But trying to figure out how to keep everybody entertained and satisfied at once was really helpful in that situation, and that translated directly into role-playing games and writing novels and all sorts of things.
Well, I don't know how you managed to entertain 25 people at a role-playing session and keep them
They
involved.
loved me, but it drove me insane.
Oh, well, I was doing good for 5, so congratulations. That's awesome. Looking at it from the role-playing game perspective, the main virtue and of course the price you pay when you convert it to a role-playing game is you have to convert a linear narrative into a sandbox world. Because unless you're just doing a single module where they're going to recreate the story, which, you know, that's a limited replayability there, then you then have to go branch out and explain everything else that didn't make it into the book, and you have to do it in a way that continues to draw them into the feel and the flavor of the world that you had. The advantage of that is I was able with the RPG to include stuff that is never going to show up in my writing in the prose. I mean, there are agencies that the readers will probably never hear about. There are, you know, the stuff that happens in the background behind the scenes that influence decisions secondarily or even at a third remove that become very important to the players. And it really adds a lot of depth and a feeling of actually living in a game when you can add in those layers for social realism, even in something like a superhero game, which is, you know, superheroes is the most unrealistic thing you can think of. But if you can make it socially realistic and something that they can relate to across the table, then you've done a wonderful thing.
So,
Go ahead.
guy in the middle,
Brennan.
you mentioned, you know, that if the game isn't fun, people will stop playing. I have a question for that. Spec Ops: The Line is not a traditionally fun game, but it's still engaging. How do you keep people engaged when dark stuff is going on and it's not a fun game in a traditional sense?
I stopped playing Spec Ops: The Line, as did one of my friends. Another one of my friends didn't. He finished it. And from what I understand from what he said is that the mechanics of that game were fun enough that the mechanics brought you through in some ways, really degrading story, and that the story was not something that really synergized with the gameplay in order to make a more fun experience, but rather the gameplay was something that allowed the author to tell the story because the mechanics were able to get somebody to continue something that may have otherwise been repugnant. And that's the best answer I can think of to give.
You have to remember that different people are searching for different emotional experiences in a game, okay? And so you may have an adventure person who wants to explore, okay? You may have somebody who is looking for the thrills of being in battle or combat. You may have a person who is looking for romance. One of the most popular games in Japan years ago was simply a game in which you go and you take a girl on a date and talk to her, and afterwards you get a rating about how good of a date you were. There are all sorts of games, and it really is a matter of you picking what emotional beats is what we call them in Hollywood that you want to appeal to, and make sure that you keep appealing to the same audience. If you're trying to write thriller beats and all of a sudden we get into horror, you're going to find that your audience feels cheated and they're going to wander away, okay? Or if all of a sudden you go into romance or comedy or something like that, people are going to start wondering what's going on here. It'll be disjointed. So maybe something as simple as that.
If you know the video game critic Yahtzee, Ben Croshaw, he has an article that I believe is titled Challenge, Context, and Catharsis. Something along those lines. If you Google it, you can find it. It's on the Escapist website. But I really like his system of analyzing games. This challenge, it's like you've got context, it means story, catharsis means just the fun of gameplay, and challenge means challenge. And these are like the three legs of the stool that most video games stand on. And you can have less of one if you have if you strengthen the others. And that's one way that you can get people through spots that they normally would not, is if they're being challenged and they're really getting a lot of gratification out of that gameplay, it can get them through rough story spots. If the story's really strong and they're just having a lot of fun, that can get them through spots where it's just not as challenging, and so on and so forth. For Spec Ops: The Line, I personally did finish it, and it was brutal. And it's quite harrowing. It's basically playing Heart of Darkness, but for me the story was very cathartic in a way. It was fascinating to play that and kind of have this disjointed experience of how bad a person am I? Like, am I doing this because the story is telling me to? Like, would I be doing this? And then the further you get into it, the more you get distant from that character and realize, no, I'm okay. I'm relieved that I don't think I'm as bad as this person. But that possibility is frightening. It's that awareness that woke me up. And that actually, because the gameplay in Spec Ops: The Lines was fairly by the numbers for me. It wasn't the gameplay that generally got me through, but it was that fascination of that just morbid, macabre fascination of where is this going, and how far am I capable of even playing this? And the answer was to the end, which is a little disturbing.
For somebody who is an amateur and is interested, what do you think of fan art in the form of games? As you guys produce works, how do you feel about someone taking it and cranking out a little game?
I have conflicted opinions on fan art in general, so I try to be understanding. That's a tribute in any respect. If they look like something you're making well enough to do that.
Given that I got through college on free ad-supported Minecraft content, a lot of it I saw was replicating other people's stuff. Like, there's a Patreon server for a Minecraft server that is based on Wizards of the Coast Forgotten Realms series, and I was talking to the author of that. He's making enough to support himself, just barely, but it's all based on free content that is given out so that he's not like selling content other people made, but he's accepting donations for a free fan-derived work, and that's really scary sometimes because you're walking a really thin line there, and I think that in some ways it's just a love letter to the works that they enjoy, trying to adapt it into a different medium, and the quality varies, but I don't necessarily think that it's anything to worry about unless there are copyright laws that make it so that you need to shut it down in order to retain your copyright. But I don't think that it detracts from the popularity of a intellectual property in order to have people in the community making works based on that intellectual property in order to continue to develop the community around it. Could be wrong.
Yeah, I kind of love it when people do it. At the same time, let's say that you create a movie or you trademark a title in a book or something like that. Anything that you trademark, the law says that if somebody goes out and does some fan art, I just about have to close them down. And I hate that because it's sort of counterintuitive. You don't really want them to be closed down because you want them to popularize your work. So it can be a catch-22. You have to realize that when Walt Disney tells you that you can't have Mickey Mouse leading your parade, it's for legal reasons. They can't not say that, or they're going to lose their copyright, or their trademark, I should say.
And Disney will say that.
And Disney will say that, yeah.
Well, the issue is a little bit different when you're dealing with something that starts as the printed word on the page, but it does come down to a question of how close control do you want to have. I have to confess, by the way, that I have committed fanfic before as a way of getting around writer's block, just to write something in something else, and I put it up online. So that's, I don't know, bad or good or whatever you want to say. Personally, as an author, I think that when somebody starts, they like my stuff well enough that they want to play in the same pool and write fanfic, for example, or do sketches and put them up on DeviantArt, I'm not going to worry about them too much. But a lot of that is especially because the background of a lot of my characters is very generic. My main character's name is Astra. That's not a name you can trademark. Just like you can't trademark Thor. You can trademark Marvel's Thor, but you could write a superhero named Thor, and as long as he's not recognizably Marvel's, you're good to go. So where I'm wandering with that, I guess, is that really, especially when it comes to games, I think it's great that the internet has allowed us to really pool as fans and create game content as hacks. Because I work with what's called the Fate system. It's a generic system that anybody can use. And I've seen fake hacks for Star Wars. I've seen fake hacks for Star Trek, for cyberpunk stuff, for almost every fantasy story out there. And I think it's a wonderful medium to be able to play in.
Other questions from you guys? Yeah.
How do you choose what to add or take out for the story and characters to be continued?
I think, like I said earlier, that part of it is knowing what makes a good video game, and then picking out the pieces of the story that are going to play well with a video game, and then what parts are integral to that medium. I like Planet Mercenary as an example. It's a humorous webcomic, right? And that humor is very integral to what Slot Mercenary is. And that RPG book, it is the only RPG handbook I have ever encountered that I just recommend as regular reading. Like, pick that up; it's hilarious. It was a pleasure to read from start to finish, and it gives you that as that aspect of Schlock Mercenary, and really encapsulates it in the game and encourages it in the gameplay when players are interacting, especially through the Mayhem cards and everything. They've designed a game that really appeals to what is most beloved about Schlock Mercenary.
I think I'm good on that one.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that lie at the heart of just about any film or book or whatever. If I were going to create a Star Wars book and decided that I didn't want to have the Force, and I didn't want to have an Empire or any stormtroopers, I'd be shooting myself in the foot pretty well. I think those are kind of definitive moments. So I look for the things that I see as being definitive to the property, and then say, okay, now how can I play with some of those elements and maybe take it beyond that? But I look for those big things that you just can't pull out, and that's what I'm going to hang on to. And then everything else is okay. My wife often complains when I'm writing, she says, oh, you take too long to write a book. And I try to explain to her that there's 10,000 right ways to write any book, just as there's 10,000 right ways to do any kind of an adaptation to a video game or something, or to a movie. But there's a million wrong ways to do it. So, I want to be careful that I don't put any of the wrong stuff in there. And that's really all I worry about. But I don't get overly concerned about what I should take in or put out, because I think the definitive things just kind of stand out to me as being monumental, and you can't stray too far from those.
Actually, I do have a comment just as a quick continuation of what you said, one of the wrong ways is when you do change mediums, be careful not to add something that breaks the world. And something that's so big that if it was there in the world at all, you would have seen it in the books and it would have had an effect on the plot. And that's a really easy way to take somebody out of a story when you're changing the medium. Don't add a new empire into Star Wars.
Have you seen that done that you can think of?
Well, with the Rune Lords, I've had a number of people, screenwriters, video game people, who all want to fix my magic system. I created a broken magic system on purpose because I wanted the magic system to have a price to it and to be painful for my characters to deal with. And so every time somebody says, "Oh, I figured out how to fix it," I'm like, that was the first thing my wife said. And I'm just like, I've got 2 words for you, but I can't repeat them here.
In terms of stuff to add and or take away, I think that the most important thing not to add is gratuitous filler. It's been said here before that the worst way to do a game is to take a little bit of cutscene that represents parts of the movie and then pad it out with, what did you say, monotonous gameplay? I like what Farland said about making sure that you add new points of interest into the middle so that the things that you do add in order to make it a 20 or 40 or whatever hour game are useful pieces of plot and narrative instead of something that you can do in order to gate access to the next part of the plot that you have already seen.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. I've seen this a lot in you've got a book, and then you go to see a movie, and all of a sudden there's what I call the mind part scene. And you're like, they only put that in there so that they could do it in the video game. Do they do that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, seriously.
At no point but to be the mind part scene.
When you're creating anything that's going to be a big IP like that, you want to look at it and say, how am I going to turn this? How am I going to turn this into a video game? How am I going to turn it into a movie? How am I going to turn it into a theme park ride? And so, yeah, unfortunately, we do have to think that way.
One last question for you guys. Tell us where we can find you and what you're working on now, and what's the worst game adaptation you've ever seen?
Oh, there are so many. I don't even know where to start on bad video game adaptations. You can find me next on Saturday. I've got a panel on folklore, 9 a.m., which I'm really looking forward to, so please come find me in Canyon. And you can hear me talk a whole lot more on a more civilized podcast, talking about Star Wars and critiquing Star Wars, and discussing a lot of Star Wars video games. So.
I'm on 9 other panels, so if you're on the gaming track, you're going to see me again. Worst video game adaptation was Sorcerer, Stabber, Orphan. I purchased it for like $7 from GameStop. It was horrible. Tried to give it back. They said it had 25 cents resale value to trade back to them, which is that's how bad that is.
I think anytime that I see that shovelware, I just cringe. Having helped discover Harry Potter and push it and everything. I remember when the movie came out and the video came out. One of the video game company I was working for, we went and asked how much it would cost to buy the rights to make a major video game, and it was going to be $50 million. So I was like, okay, I was really expecting a great video game when they came out. Not so. It was pure crap. In any case, and that's kind of par for the course for movie adaptations, because they typically get the right to make the video game shortly after the movie's released. They don't have the visuals, and so they can't do very much. Okay, there's no plot time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.